Hello and welcome to a very special lecture. My name is Katie Bossler. I'm a club fellow and environmental journalist, and I have the great pleasure of serving on a new committee that was formed to celebrate 40 years of women in the Explorers Club. Tonight, we are taking a look into the past to present Women Explorers in History. This is to celebrate International Day of Women and Girls in Science, a global day of recognition started by the United Nations. This event launches our year-long series of exciting programs, media, and educational outreach to honor and showcase women in the field. And something our team has been working on really hard to create is a short film spotlighting women explorers, which will air in the spring, and I'll share more about this at the end. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to share a few statistics about women in STEM, STEM being, of course, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, to give a sense of where things stand. Worldwide, women represent only 28% of the workforce in STEM. The gender gaps are particularly high in some of the fastest growing and highest paid jobs like computer science and engineering. The numbers are lower than they should be because girls and young women, as they pursue careers in the sciences, face both subtle and blatant discrimination, everything from a lack of mentorship, harmful stereotypes, to sexual harassment and bullying, which 50% of women in the sciences report experiencing. And perhaps more understated, but still harmful, issues like being talked over in meetings or not getting the appropriate credit for work. According to research published in Science magazine, women in STEM report that they are granted less respect and authority and have to work harder to be successful compared with men. And widely, they report wanting a sense of belonging in these spaces. Women in STEM can earn nearly $15,000 less per year than men. That number compounds for women of color. Latina and Black women in STEM earn around $33,000 less. The United Nations started this day to spotlight the gaps and amplify efforts to close them. Our effort at the Explorers Club to feature extraordinary women, each with their unique story and lens on the world, begins tonight. There will be a live question and answer portion after the presentation, so please put your questions in the comments as they occur to you. It's now my pleasure to introduce our brilliant speakers, Milbry Polk and Lacey Flint. Lacey Flint is the Archivist and Curator of Research Collections at the Explorers Club. I'm going to embarrass her a little bit by singing her praises. She has been instrumental to digitizing the collection, and let's be honest, her inbox is probably much more interesting than mine or yours. In any given day, she gets inquiries into everything from expeditions that occurred centuries ago to facts about man-eating tigers. She also serves as a contributing curator on the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum. She will guide us through a history of women's involvement at the Explorers Club. But first up, we have Milbry Polk, who is our brave committee leader and a Sweeney Awards medalist and currently serves on the board. After graduating with a degree in anthropology from Harvard University, Milbry set out into the world to photograph and publish articles for prestigious magazines. She is the author of Women of Discovery, and tonight she'll be joining us from her very own collection of over 1,500 books by or about women explorers. She certainly is an expert on the topic, and it's my pleasure to hand it off to her to begin our year of learning and wondering together. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'm really happy to be here tonight to kick off this wonderful year of celebrating women at the club. I can just figure out how to do this. Then we can start. There we go. Thank you all for joining. And I must say, it's very strange to be giving a lecture when I can't see anyone, but I'll do my best. There is a pervasive idea that history, and we're talking here about exploration history, that is about men. The great man approach has been dominant for at least 2,000 years. So much of history we read and know leaves out half the story, and this is wrong. History is everyone's story. To ignore women in history disenfranchises half the population. We need to tell the whole story. But as I've discovered, women's stories are difficult to find, buried, hidden, or lost. Still, we need to try to find them and tell them. And I found the stories that I found are great. Just to be sure we're on the same page, which I'm sure we are, here are my definitions of exploration. And I'll tell you, I'm not going to read the slides, so that's up to you. We will see some modifications in the stories that which I will take into consideration, including culture, times, limitations, and situations. Explorers are people with a purpose who go where they must to find answers. Explorers push us towards a moment of clarity when things that were obscure or unseen come into a new focus and so illuminate the landscape. Exploration is about knowledge, and that is important historically as it is today. Our challenging world needs explorers, and we've always needed explorers. We need the voice, wisdom, and courage of those out on the edge to help us find the right path forward, and we need to see the vast swath of history that got us to this point. Like many of you, I've been exploring my whole life. I was lucky enough to grow up in Egypt, which had a huge impact on me, and I was able to go on my first major expedition when I was 23 across the western desert of Egypt on the trail of Alexander the Great, and that was followed by many more expeditions. You might be surprised to know how many people asked me over the years if I was afraid because I was a woman, and that made me think. I really did not encounter many women explorers in the places where I was traveling, and I certainly had not read about them in history books. That is when I decided to look for women explorers. It has been a years-long hunt. Researching my book, Women of Discovery, was like a detective story. My co-author, Mary Tigreen, and I would go to every secondhand bookstore we could find and rummage through stacks, hoping to come across a forgotten book. Sometimes we were lucky, because if anything, we found women were prolific writers, even if there was no second edition. Gradually, starting from footnotes and general histories of exploration, I started building a library. Today, I have, give or take, around 1,500 books by and about women explorers, and this is only a beginning. It was hard to select just a few women to talk about today, as there are so many great stories. I've limited myself to historical women and then chose a handful to demonstrate some of the various ways women managed to go out into the world. Of course, women were always explorers. Our species roamed out of Africa and eventually populated the world, and women were certainly equal partners in that endeavor. In fact, I believe that exploration is encoded in our DNA. Exploration is what makes us human. The curiosity, drive, search for answers, for connections, for understanding is a human endeavor. While the earliest stories are lost to us, we can only tease out a few tidbits from archaeology. For the purposes of this talk, I'm sticking to stories we know, to people who have a name and who made an impact. And these are the women I'm going to be talking about tonight. I'll start with Gudrid, the far traveler. She lived in Iceland around the turn of the first millennium. She traveled from Iceland to Greenland and on to Newfoundland, back to Iceland, to Norway, to Europe, to Rome, and back to Iceland. A very unusual itinerary for the day. This map, drawn some 500 years ago, shows the areas that Gudrid traveled in the North Sea region. And I think you can probably pick out Greenland and Iceland, the coast of North America, and Ireland and England. Let's see. And you can see from this map that the Norse people, or the like Gudrid, were dependent upon the currents that made travel possible in her day. And of course, they didn't have compasses and things like that, and they depended on sails. So really the currents were what enabled them to move around the North Sea areas. The record of her journeys are detailed in 2 Icelandic sagas. They discuss her life in Iceland, and this is her reconstruction of her homestead. And in Greenland, this is the ruins of her home there. And her home in North America was discovered by another woman explorer, Anne Stein Ingstad. I am going to focus on one of her journeys as a pilgrim. For many cultures and religions, pilgrimage was a legitimate way women could travel. Some religions even demanded that they do so, and we know from many accounts that women took to the roads in droves. As an aside, think how liberating it was to go to confession, not to your parish priest who knew everyone's business, but to some foreign priest who probably did not even understand what you were saying, so you could pour out your transgressions and be absolved with no one the wiser. Gudrid was born a pagan and converted later in life. The trip to Rome, the center of learning, was an important step for her to take. There are hints that she met with Pope Johannes at the time. If this is true, it may be that she was the first person to bring word of the existence of the North American continent to the key center of knowledge in the West. Remember, this is 1000 AD, 500 years before Columbus. And Gudrid had not only been there, she'd lived there, given birth to a son in North America. She had encounters with Native Americans, probably the Beothunk peoples, and had survived shipwreck and other great dangers. It would be amazing to find in the Vatican Library some record of that meeting. After Rome, presumably with the Pope's blessing, she returned to Iceland and established an abbey. Another way women managed to explore was to utilize a skill. Since men were funded by government or the military, focused on acquiring land or minerals or gold, treasure in whatever form, and that follows that men formed the societies that supported exploration. They collected the documents and controlled the press that published the results. Women had to rely more on their wits and skills to take them to far away places. One such was a Jamaican woman, Mary Seacole. She was a healer with knowledge of Jamaican and West African herbal remedies, which she learned from her mother. Nursing schools would not be available for training until after the Crimean War, when Florence Nightingale established the first one in 1860. Seacole used her knowledge to treat what were then terrifying and deadly diseases, which took her to Panama and then the Crimea. No small feat for a woman, let alone a Black woman of her time. Seacole first traveled in 1850 from Jamaica to Panama to help her brother run a hotel on the route people took across the country to get a ship to take them to California. She nursed many of the population through terrible bouts of cholera, and she established a hotel for women, a very unusual thing of her time. Hearing about the Crimean War, Seacole tried to volunteer to go aid the wounded, but was turned down. So she raised her own money to travel there and brought her own supplies. She established her own hotel there to attend the wounded on the dreadful battlefields of that disastrous war. She was known for her medicines, diagnosis, and minor surgery. She wrote an autobiography of her travels and remains today an inspiration for many people. Another area that women had to strive to overcome was lack of education. In many times in history and in many cultures, it was generally felt that women only needed to know as much as they needed to run households or help their husbands. Women had to fight for an education. In fact, in the 1800s, with the new scientific fields opening up, women managed to squeeze in, but they were not allowed into the scientific societies or universities. They were thought smart enough and useful enough to collect and give over the collections to men. Men were the scientists. Women were the scientizers. They could collect but not publish. There were many examples of women who were working all over the world, painting, collecting, identifying, and building up the basis of many scientific fields. In fact, it was thought fashionable for ladies, for example, to botanize, collect plants. But those who went further, making connections, understanding the complexities of the field, and making discoveries, were frustrated. One example was Mary Kingsley. Her father was a doctor and explorer, and her uncle a famous novelist. She was raised to take care of her parents. Her father allowed her to study German so she could translate articles for him, but that was it for formal education. Luckily, he was gone a lot, and she found the key to his library and educated herself in his absence. When he died, her brother offered that she come live with him and take care of his house as she had done for their parents. She declined, took her small inheritance, bought a ticket to the farthest place she could go, a place white women, unless they were wives of missionaries, did not go, West Africa. After several trips, she settled on the Gabon. Before she left England, she got a small commission from the British Museum to collect fish. She would discover a number of unknown species, and a few were named for her. Once at the Ogowé River, she got a canoe, stocked some provisions, and set herself up as a trader along the river, collecting her fish, studying cannibalism and fetish. She wrote a delightful book about her adventures, which is still in print. She called it The Blessings of a Good Thick Skirt. The title of her book comes from a fall into an elephant trap, a pit lined with poisoned snakes. She was saved by her thick skirts, which prevented her skin being pierced. She had decided to travel wearing Victorian costume, including the lucky skirts, corsets, and hats, because she wanted to honor the people with whom she would live and travel. When she returned from her first trip, she was a sensation, and she traveled all over England giving lectures about her journey. Her book was a great success, and she returned to Africa to write another book. By this time, she was learning the languages. That is another area where women excelled. They were dependent upon the people, as they often traveled alone, and so became bridges between disparate worlds. That's what got Kingsley into trouble. She began to understand that the people with whom she lived and traveled had a religious and cultural life equal to Christianity. She became known for criticizing Christian missionaries and their work for taking away African culture without providing any real benefits in return. That message was not popular with the British, who at the time were furiously raising money for missionaries to go out to convert heathens. In a sort of despair, Kingsley volunteered to be a nurse in the Boer War, treating prisoners, knowing she would probably catch a disease and die, which she did. Thankfully, her books live on. As you can see by now, creating bridges between different worlds were another area women explorers excelled and still do today. One example I came across was the heartbreaking story of Lady Wen Chi. She was an accomplished poet and musician, a court lady in the late Han Empire. Between 194 and 195, China entered a period of chaos and were repeatedly invaded by nomads. On one incursion, Xiongnu nomads entered into the Chinese capital and kidnapped Lady Wen Chi along with other hostages, taking them way beyond the frontier to the steppes of East Asia, beyond anything she knew. At that time, the nomadic and Han culture were very different, and I suspect that each viewed the other as not altogether human. For Wen Chi, this was a disaster. But in time, she married a nomadic leader and had 2 sons. After 12 years, she was ransomed and returned back to her former life. But she soon discovered it was all gone. Her house was gone, her family dead. She was alone and too far away to ever return to her nomad family. She wrote a series of searing poems about her life and the nomads, portraying them as loving, altogether human, something new for her time and culture. It was such an important breakthrough and so heartbreaking that her poems have inspired numerous paintings over the centuries. The Met in New York has a fine collection. And one area, luckily, that women excelled was writing. The first autobiography in English was written by Marguerite of Kemp, a prolific pilgrim. One of the first modern travelogues was written by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was connected to the British royal family. Her husband was appointed as the ambassador to Constantinople. Mary decided to accompany him, which at the time was just not done. But she not only decided to go, but scandalously left and made the trip to Turkey by carriage across Europe on her own. Once there, she set about learning all she could about the country, visiting villages and harems alike. All of this is detailed in the marvelous letters she wrote home, letters which are still in print. While there, she made an amazing discovery. It was that the Turks used a method probably learned from peoples further east to combat the worst scourge of the day, smallpox. What they did was scrape the skin and press a small bit of pox into the cut. This was in effect inoculation. She had had it done to herself. Mary was especially interested in this because not only was it ravaging Europe, causing more deaths, it was believed, than the Black Plague, killing 1 in 4 people who had contact with it at the time, but she herself had it and bore scars, and her only brother had died of smallpox. On returning to England, she did everything in her power to tell people about her discovery. She convinced the king to take condemned people, inoculate them, and put them in prison with people suffering from smallpox. If they remained free of the disease, the king pardoned them. She thus instituted some of the first clinical medical trials. The king even had some of his female grandchildren inoculated. Then the backlash started. She was called a witch and condemned for consorting with heathens. Her discovery faded away. It would be another 50 or so years before Edward Jenner would take up her discovery and now be credited for finding the cure for this dreaded disease. One role that is totally overlooked and sadly often lost is the role of Indigenous women played in aiding explorers. Of course, many are not even named. A Chippewayan woman was instrumental in John Franklin's overland expedition up the Coppermine River of 1819 to 22, called one of the most harrowing overland journeys of Arctic exploration. But Franklin only calls the women responsible for his survival greenstockings in his diaries. But one story we do know, because the explorer wrote about it, and unusually at the time, gave the woman credit who many times over saved his life. Her name was Tukalituk, also called Hannah by British and American explorers. She was born at Cape Cyril in the Cumberland Sound on Baffin Island in 1838. Her central story takes place almost entirely at sea on an ice floe, the nearly tragic end of Captain Hall's Polaris expedition. But before we get to that, I want to mention a little bit about her background and some of the expeditions she was on. Her family were renowned as hunters, guides, and translators, and much prized by explorers. Her brother, Inuluapik, traveled with whaler William Penny to Aberdeen in 1839 and is one of the only Inuit at the time known to have written his own memoirs. Her mother was known for her map-making abilities, and other siblings also aided explorers and whalers. In 1853, a whaling captain named John Bowlby took Tutulakuk and 2 other Inuit to England, where she was exhibited like a zoo display throughout the north of the country. And later she was received by Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle. She learned English. Unlike many less scrupulous showmen, Bowlby returned the group to the Arctic after 20 months. As an aside, many indigenous peoples were brought to Europe for display, were tragically abandoned to their fate, never being able to make the journey home. And we do have the stories of some of those people. Then Tukulatuk met Charles Francis Hall, an Arctic explorer. Hall's plan, unprecedented among Arctic explorers of the time, was to live alone with and learn from the Inuit. And this is one reason we know so much about her story. Their first expedition was to search for relics from Frobisher's expedition in the 1500s and his mining venture on Baffin Island. The second expedition was to look for survivors of John Franklin's lost expedition. Their third expedition was an attempt to reach the North Pole. They departed from New York City in June 1871, bound for northern Greenland. It was not a happy crew, and there was serious infighting aboard. By the fall, Hall was dead of poisoning. In the late winter, on the return home during a storm, the ship was rocked and squeezed between 2 ice floes. Some crew jumped onto the ice to collect the food and equipment that was being tossed overboard when the sailors feared the ship was about to sink. Suddenly, the ship separated from the ice and disappeared into the storm, stranding 2 Inuit families, including 5 children, 7 German crew members, the African-American cook, and an English steward, 19 people in all, on the ice. In one of the greatest survival stories ever, the party survived for 6 months on a series of increasingly shrinking ice floes until all of its members were finally rescued on April 30th, 1873, off the coast of Labrador, a journey of 1,500 miles by ice floe. After their rescue, Tukuliti traveled to Washington, D.C., where she testified about the expedition in Congress. She never returned to the Arctic and was buried in Connecticut. So I will end where I began, with the story about a woman I found in a footnote. Growing up, I loved the stories about the explorers who searched for the source of the Nile. Sir Richard Burton was a great favorite of mine. So was Baker, who found the source. I was very surprised to read that Baker was sick, probably with malaria, during much of his expedition, and was led by his wife, Florence, a woman he bought in a slave market. But the footnote in a history book that I read mentioned a woman, Alexandrine Tine, who led an expedition of women to search for the Nile's source. The mentions of her I read were derogatory. I even found a Christian educational pamphlet from the 1870s that used her as an example of how not to be a good Christian woman. The more I uncovered of her story, the more I was astonished. It was one of grandeur, discovery, triumph, and tragedy, yet her passion led her to persevere. Her story, though tragic, illuminates the special spirit many women explorers share. In 1861, an unusual camel caravan was making its way across the harsh deserts of the Sudan. It was led by the 26-year-old Dutch woman. It included her mother, her aunt, who was getting over a love affair with the Tsar of Russia, their maids and servants, 102 camels carrying silver, musical instruments, a library, food, wine, scientific gear, in short, everything they thought they would need for a prolonged stay in the wilderness. They were headed towards Khartoum, the staging area for expeditions up the Nile. There she would encounter the best-known explorers of the day, Livingstone, Burton, Speke, and Baker, none of whom were pleased to see them, especially as Tine had rented the only barge available for the first stage of the journey through the southern swamps. Baker called them mad. Speke tried to get any reports they would write struck from the prestigious Royal Geographic Society, an effort which luckily failed. During their 3 years Tine spent in the swamp, she made a large and important botanical collection, eventually housed in the Imperial Herbarium in Vienna, and an ethnographic collection housed in Liverpool. Both collections were bombed during World War II, so luckily her reports survived in the RGS. She also worked to free all the slaves she encountered, even buying dozens of them. Many attached themselves to her, and upon her return to Cairo, she had a household of former slaves, which she educated and found jobs for. But Tine paid a terrible price. Her mother, aunt, and maids died in the swamp. She sent their bodies in lead-lined coffins back to Holland, a trip she would never make. In 1867, she left for Algiers to plan another expedition to Timbuktu. In 1869, she was murdered in the desert when the Tuareg tribesmen thought her large barrels contained gold. They contained water, which ironically was actually worth more than gold in the deserts. Her body was never found. Why don't we know about her? Historically, women explored differently than men. They were not allowed in, so were not bound by the institutions that governed men. It gave them a sort of freedom, not bound by sponsors, not having to get a first or to conquer. They were free to roam. They meandered, learned languages, and lived with distant peoples. Well into the 20th century, many academic societies, clubs, colleges, and universities were run by men. Women were excluded. I've just begun the process of discovering these little-known stories of women explorers. There's so much more to find, to learn, and be inspired by. Since we published Women of Discovery, a number of books have been written about historical women explorers, and I look forward to many more. Our Explorers Club finally allowed women to join in 1981, the milestone we're celebrating this year. I will leave you now and turn to Lacey, who will bring this story into the 20th century, where we will find so many more women explorers whose stories we know. Obstacles are still there, but it is getting better. Everyone has something to contribute to exploration. We're all on our own path of discovery. Thank you so much. And Lacey, over to you.
Thank you, Milbry. That was fantastic. Definitely a tough act to follow. All right, let me cue up my screen for everybody. Okay, so hello. My name is Lacey Flint. I am the Archivist and Curator at the club. I'm thrilled to be here tonight. I would first love to thank Milbry and Katie for putting this night together, putting this event together. It's been fantastic. And on that note, also really would like to thank the efforts of all of the women on the 40th anniversary committee. We are so excited for this year-long celebration, which will honor and amplify women explorers. So stay tuned. This is just the first night of many. But for those of you who may be joining us for the very first time and thinking, what is the Explorers Club? I'm going to give you a 2-second crash course, so to speak. So we were founded in 1905, and we were founded by 7 Arctic explorers. And essentially these men came together and said, well, wait a second, there's really a lot more to explore than just the Arctic. And so their ideas became the foundation of our mission, which today is to explore land, sea, air, and space. And you know, that was our mission. We've since accomplished sort of these incredible notable firsts, although I will say all of them accomplished by men. We were the first to the North and South Pole, first to the highest and lowest points on Earth, and first to the surface of the moon. But how have women played into this narrative? So we're going to kind of shift from Milbry's really fantastic broader view and switch to kind of this narrow scope and focus of women at the club. So we're going to take a look now. Sorry. With just a bit of history to start with. Let me move that away. Sorry about that. Okay. So with just a bit of history, as I said, we were founded in 1905, and to my left here, you've got an excerpt from our certificate of incorporation. And here you can see, this was adopted October 18th of 1905, and you can see in the 4th line here, the purpose of the club is to encourage explorers in their work, right? So they don't define what an explorer looks like, who an explorer is, which I think is really interesting. And if we were all together in person, usually I start my lectures with what does it mean to be an explorer? What does an explorer look like? And especially with young explorers, as we call them, you know, it's never gender specific, which I think is always really exciting and just kind of shows where we are now today. But, you know, so this is the certificate of incorporation. All seems well and good, right? You move over to the bylaws, which were adopted only a week later, and it very clearly defines that persons eligible for active memberships shall be men. You can't eliminate half the population and expect that half of the population to not be doing what you're doing, to not be exploring, right? And so, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about the unheralded, unsung women of the Explorers Club before they were officially members of the club. So I'd be remiss if I did not start off with talking about the Polar Wives. Now, these women played a crucial role in publicizing, defending, and even financing, in some cases, their husbands' expeditions. And as I said, we have these Arctic roots at the club, right? We were founded by members of the Arctic Club of America. Robert Perry was one of our earliest members. He was our 4th club president, but notably, I want to talk about his wife, Josephine, Jo Perry. She was absolutely incredible, a pioneering Arctic explorer in her own right, author, scientist, and she published a number of books, one of them being My Arctic Journal in 1893, which sort of later transitioned into what we now call Snow Baby. The Arctic Journal still exists, but was sort of added to, because aside from being this incredible woman explorer on this expedition, she was in Greenland, less than 13 degrees from the North Pole, and she gave birth to her and Robert Perry's first child, Marie. And so that's Marie there in that photo for Snow Baby, which is just kind of incredible. Next, we'll move to Eva Nansen. She was Fridtjof's wife, Fridtjof Nansen, early polar explorer as well, sort of a rock star, again, in his own right. And aside from being an accomplished singer, Eva was a pioneering skier. You see her there in her ski outfit. She was the first woman to ski across the Hardanger Plateau in Norway. She did this in 1892. And she was getting some accolades for that accomplishment, but very notably, one of the things that she also received was criticism for her outfit. It was apparently deemed immoral. And actually it was designed by Fridtjof Nansen, which is kind of an interesting twist there too. I could go on and on about the polar wives. You've got Emily Shackleton, Ernest Shackleton's wife, Jackie Roney, who was the first woman to be a working member of an Antarctic expedition. That was 1947 to 1948. She was an incredible pioneer as well. But we are going to shift to kind of talk about women at the club and actually at the various clubhouses that we've had. So as they frequently are today, events and lectures were arranged to acknowledge the accomplishments of particular explorers. Even though women couldn't be members of the club did still acknowledge their accomplishments by inviting them to speak. So first up, the very first woman who was invited to speak went by Mrs. Alec Tweedy, and that was her preferred title. Her actual name is Ethel Brilliana Tweedy. And she spoke at the club in December of 1912. She was an English travel author, a writer, really, really incredible, super, super independent. You see A Girl's Ride in Iceland there. That's one of her many, many, many published works. This particular one is from 1889. But she was incredibly independent. Her husband actually died very suddenly in 1896, but she continued traveling, and kind of to Milbry's point of women being sort of free to roam, Ethel didn't let that unfortunate passing stop her, which is really incredible. So she kicked off the women speaking at the club. And then in 1914, Mabel Cook Cole sort of took over. She and her husband, Fay Cooper Cole, spoke. They were both anthropologists, really, really accomplished anthropology partners. They sort of always worked in tandem for the most part. But this is one of Mabel's published works, Philippine Folktales. She was really interested in bringing to life these stories and sharing these stories with the rest of the world. Moving on to the official start of Ladies' Night. So Mabel Cook Cooper, Mabel Cook Cole sort of kicked off this Ladies' Night idea in 1914 when, aside from women explorers being invited to the club, actual women were invited to the club. Previously, I mean, it was a gentleman's club, right? It was just a place for the guys to get together and hang out, talk about their expeditions. But women were now permitted to come to certain lectures. And these events were sporadic, but I think, 1922, 23, 24, they had kicked up enough that in 1925, the board had deemed that ladies be invited to the club on not more than 2 special occasions during each year. And kind of bringing us all back from that was Harriet Chalmers Adams, who spoke in 1925 at the sort of reinvigorated ladies' nights with these new rules established. And she, if you're not familiar with her, absolutely incredible. She was a noted explorer, a photographer, a war correspondent. The photo that you see in the center there is actually one of hers that was published in Nat Geo in June of 1921. You see the Grand Canyon Bridge there. And she also very notably was one of the founders of the Society of Women Geographers. And the club has a long parallel history with the Society of Women Geographers because the society frequently met at the Explorers Club, especially when we moved to our current headquarters location now. So a lot of crossover there. We'll scoot on over to Mary Jobe Akeley, who spoke at a ladies' night in 1930. She was really, really well-rounded in terms of exploration. She went from being this kind of pioneering mountaineer to working in the Congo with her husband, Carl Akeley. And so she was invited to speak at the club in 1930, which was the year after Carl passed away. He was an Explorers Club president, the father of modern taxidermy. He was He is for whom the Akeley Hall of African Mammals is named at the Museum of Natural History. And Mary continued Carl's work in the sense that she worked with the Museum of Natural History, creating these taxidermy exhibits. And the whole purpose behind them really was to make people feel like they were in the field, because this early taxidermy really ironically was a form of conservation. It was the way that people were able to educate audiences about animals and about wildlife that, you couldn't bring people on safari, as easily as you can today. So that was really the primary medium for talking about these things. And ultimately, she really became a crusader for establishing game preserves and gained recognition for her efforts to save endangered species in Africa. So incredibly accomplished, Mary Jo Akeley there. You can see her with the binoculars. Now we get to the incomparable Amelia Earhart. So in 1932, essentially, along with Yvette Borup, who was the wife of Roy Chapman Andrews and an incredible explorer in her own right, Amelia Earhart and Yvette Borup kind of got together and said, well, wait a second, to their husbands, because Amelia, of course, was partners with Charles Palmer Putnam. Roy Chapman Andrews and Charles Palmer Putnam, huge figures at the Explorers Club, both club presidents. And they essentially said to their husbands, well, we're on these expeditions with you, or we are the more accomplished explorer. How come we can't be involved at the Explorers Club? And so in 1932, the club formed the Honorary Roll of Women. And this is an excerpt of the resolution that the board wrote to Amelia Earhart in June of 1932, basically saying, we admire you, we respect you, you've accomplished so much, please join our ranks, so to speak. And you can actually see her there in that photo. It's one of my most favorite photos in the collection. You can see her there with Richard Byrd, and he is getting a flag for one of his expeditions. Amelia never carried the flag, unfortunately. That is a right afforded to only members, so she was never permitted to carry the flag, although to my knowledge, never asked. I would hope she would have been given the flag should she have requested it, but you can see her there with the flag, which is sort of an iconic moment. And then you can see her here. She actually hosted the first ladies' night at the time what were our new club headquarters at 72nd Street. And interestingly enough, it was as part of her ladies' night duties, she was responsible for presenting the club with a mascot, ended up being a kitten. And that was just sort of one of the ways they wanted to welcome her and bring her into the fold, so to speak. So make of that what you will. And speaking of, these are pieces from the actual club collection. And to kind of dovetail off of that, we're going to talk a little bit about other items from women explorers in the collection. So this you can see here, and I apologize if it's a little blurry. I was trying to make it as big as possible without overstretching it too much. But this is a hand-drawn map, and it's one from a series of hand-drawn maps drawn by H.F. Milne, who was the leading cartographer for the RGS. And this actually puts together side by side the routes. This is the Transjordan, the routes from the Transjordan from 1912 to 1925. And it combines Gertrude Bell, Alois Musil, Vivian Holt, and Henry Field. And if you look closely, really towards the center of your screen, you can see this red line here. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse or not, but Bell right here, you can see her route through this area here, detailed in the red. And it's just, it's really interesting to kind of compare the routes that these explorers took. And it's incredible and also really wonderful that Bell is listed on this map among these three men because her work was so significant. Next up, one of my favorites, Osa Johnson. She was a filmmaker and a writer who, along with her husband Martin, created a very popular series of films featuring African and South Sea tribal groups and wildlife. She was known as the heroine of 1,000 Thrills. You can see her in the Jeep, sort of leaning out the window there. And just sort of anecdotally, Martin, who was often operating the camera, as you can see again in the Jeep, he's riding above it. You can see the camera there. That's Martin, that's Osa. he used to say, well, I know I can film and shoot whatever's coming at me from behind the camera because Osa will defend us and she will shoot whatever's coming at me from any other angle. So kind of an interesting trait there that she became sort of the protector. And when you think of the traditional gender roles. And finally, the last kind of sneak peek from the collection I'm going to show you is Marie Tharp. And this is her map of the North Atlantic Ocean from 1952. She was a geologist and oceanographic cartographer. She helped create, this is the first scientific map of the Atlantic Ocean floor, and it reveals detailed topography and multidimensional landscapes. She also was the first to really discover plate tectonics, although she didn't ultimately get credit until years and years later. And I pulled this map for another reason, because one of the incredible things about my job, and I say this all the time, is you never know who you're going to meet, right? So it's very common, an astronaut and a mountain climber and an oceanographer walk into the Explorers Club, right? But we have had the privilege to meet Sylvia Earle on a number of times. She works very closely with the club and we love her so much. But on one of those occasions, she was actually filming in the map room. And so I had come up because they had asked if we could pull some archival maps just to have in the background for B-roll, right? And so I pulled this one because it was on top, and I knew, in an abstract way, it was the North Atlantic Ocean floor map. And I knew Marie Tharp was a part of it, but I didn't realize the significance of it because I am not an expert in oceanographic maps whatsoever. And one of my favorite things about my job is that I get to learn something new really almost every day. And so we pulled this map, and the camera crew looked at me and said, oh, can you tell us about this so that way Sylvia knows what to say? And I was like, oh, it's something general. And Sylvia was like, well, actually, I can speak to it really, really well, and launched into this story and the history of Marie Tharp and why she was so impressive and such a pioneer. And since then, it's just been a really incredible sort of moment and memory for us at the club to think about that. So it really is, a living collection in that sense as well, which is really fantastic. And now we'll kind of get to the moment I'm sure we've all been waiting for, right? Is that 1981 and the catalyst for women becoming members, right? So there were a couple of instances throughout the club's history prior to 1981 when women had either asked to become members or the question of women's membership came up. But it wasn't until late 1980 that an unnamed woman applied for membership, and it's listed in the minutes. A woman sent in her application materials by the membership director, listed all of that information. And then nothing happened after that. There was no mention of it. And then a couple of months later, in the board minutes, there was a note saying the woman who applied for membership has refused to rescind her membership. This really raised the question of, what do we do now, right? Can we continue going on as this all-male club? And so, and it is funny that she remains unnamed in the minutes. I'm still not sure who she is, but that prompted Carl Sagan to write this really impassioned letter. And this is just an excerpt of the letter itself, and I do encourage you to read the whole thing. But notably, he says, if membership in the Explorers Club is restricted to men, the loss will be ours. We are only depriving ourselves. And so, he really calls the club out saying, how can we eliminate half the population and call ourselves the preeminent meeting place for explorers when we're completely discounting women and their accomplishments, because they have accomplished incredible feats of scientific exploration in their own right. And so ultimately, because those 1905 bylaws said members shall be men, it was a bylaws change, had to go to the full membership at an annual meeting. And the bylaws were ultimately amended and adopted to include women. However, I will say the vote was really close. It was not a landslide, and there was a lot of debate as to whether or not women should become members of the club. And I will say today, our women members, I'm not going to go too much into current members because that's what the teaser is for our film coming out next month. But women members are very strong in the club. Our women membership, we've done a lot of catching up after the 75-year head start that the male membership had on us. It's been really incredible to kind of see that development and see how quickly women have made a name for themselves at the Explorers Club after sort of being left out for so long. And with that, I think we can open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Lacey, and thank you, Milbry. We're getting lots of comments and questions. Keep them coming. We'll be here for the next 20 minutes or so. I think it's wonderful that while our world is in such great flux in reconciling deep issues of abuse against the planet and people, that we're able to have such wonderful and frank conversations that move the idea of equity for all forward. I think we can all agree that we're richer for understanding the world by listening to others and to the natural world. Milbry, we have one fan of yours who is wondering where people can find your book, Women of Discovery, and is curious if you have any plans to update it or do a second edition.
I would love to update it and do a second edition. The only place that I know you can buy it now is maybe on Amazon or one of the secondhand bookstores. It's kind of dated. And what I would really like to work on, again, if I can find a publisher, is a book on polar women explorers, because that's an area that women were very active in the North, but they're very, very little known. And so there are a lot of wonderful stories up, from that part of the world.
And Lacey, you mentioned a bit about Robert and Josephine Perry. Someone had asked if there are or if it was other stories of wives who were not credited, although participated in their husbands' or partners' expeditions, if that was sort of a common story or something that you've seen in history.
Absolutely, yeah, and it doesn't just pertain to polar wives or polar exploration. It really happened in all manners of exploration that you saw. You can't just leave your wife at home for months and months on end. Women want to be a part of the story too. So there are plenty of stories where women have been on the expedition and not gotten any credit. I mean, if you think of Marie Tharp in and of herself, I mean, she didn't get credit for so long for so much of her work. Not that she was necessarily married to any of the people she was working with, but it's more of an issue of women not getting credit than kind of them being on expedition with their husband. That women, if you look at Ethel Tweedy, Mrs. Alec Tweedy, she wasn't alone on her expeditions, right? Wasn't alone in her travels, but her husband had died. And so she was kind of on her own in the sense that she was going to publish her work and do it herself. Otherwise, the men she was with were going to take credit for her story. So it's really powerful to kind of see where women have inserted themselves into the story, knowing that, and into the narrative, knowing that they were a part of it the whole time and they weren't going to kind of let this slide. So those early narratives and those early publications are some of the most interesting to read because, you've got these really stringent gender roles at that time. And yet you've got these women in the field doing these incredible things and making these discoveries in their own right.
And I thought it was interesting. You mentioned a comment about one of the outfits of the polar wives being deemed immoral. Yet a little known fact about Robert Perry is he impregnated a 12-year-old Inuit girl. And this is something that is sort of not talked about as he's valorized. But on the topic of attire, Milbry, you in your book feature a few women who had to disguise themselves and wear men's outfits to actually go out. Was this a common tactic?
It really just depended, but there are some famous examples. There was one woman who dressed like a man and became a conquistador, and she was only discovered when she was put in prison for murder to actually be a woman. So she was rampaging through South America as a man. So there are many other examples of women that went dressed as men, but they're all kinds,
And Lacey had mentioned the Marie Tharp story and also invoked Sylvia Earle, who's one of the women featured in our upcoming film. Milbry, you witnessed this moment of these two women who did so much for the oceans meeting each other. Can you share that with us?
That was a wonderful night that I used to run another organization, and we were giving an award to Sylvia Earle, and I knew Marie. She lived close to me, and I brought her into the evening, and that was the first time those two women met, and they just held their arms out to each other, and it was really very magical. It was a very special evening. Marie was a very interesting person, very very humble. I found that a lot of these women, they're people, so they're all different kinds, but a lot of them were very humble about their accomplishments. And Marie
And,
was
and,
extraordinary.
and Lacey, you had mentioned Amelia Earhart, who of course was so influential in aviation and a household name. Currently, worldwide, under 6% of pilots are women. It's still an area where women stand to make great gains. Milbry, in your book, you feature Bessie Coleman, who was an African-American woman who had to leave the United States to train in Europe to get her license. And she came back and she was so talented that she was asked to perform acrobatically in all of these places. And she refused to perform unless the audience was not segregated, which was a very big political move for her time. Could you share something about her with us?
I think if I remember, she died young in an accident, but it was very difficult for her to be trained. And a lot of women found it very difficult to be trained in whatever area they were interested in. And it still to this day there are a lot of barriers, but it was particularly difficult then for aviation. During World War II, of course, a lot of women were pilots because they needed them to take all the planes back to Europe, either the damaged ones back to the factories or the new ones out to the men. So they had to know how to fly a lot of different kinds of planes. And you may know that after the war ended, most of them were handed little slips of paper inviting them to become stewardesses on the new airlines. And so a lot of them quit, of course. And many of them started little flying schools all around the country and trained the men that would then go on to join the Air Force and other and civil aviation. So women have found a way to stay in whatever it is that they're really interested in, but it's been difficult.
That was actually how my grandma got her start flying, was during World War II, testing planes. My grandpa would build them in the garage and she would test fly them. And I think about the extraordinary confidence you have to have in your marriage to do something like that. Kathy Sullivan wrote a comment, and she was the first American woman to space, and also part of our film. We're so excited to have her involved. And she wrote that she joined the Society of Women Geographers before the 1981 vote that admitted her to the Explorers Club. I know both of you know a lot about the history of that club being founded and some of the crossover that happened early on. I'm wondering if you could let us know a bit more about that.
Go ahead, Lacey.
Sure. So as I mentioned, it was founded, one of the founders was Harriet Chalmers Adams. And essentially it was, I don't want to say the Explorers Club for women, but it really was intended to be a gathering place for these women who had been left out of the narrative, and they wanted their turn to speak and to collaborate and to share their findings. And so that was really the foundation of their founding. And then their parallel kind of crossover with the club, of course, as Kathy mentioned, hello, Kathy. Many of our earliest members were members of the Society of Women Geographers, and I think still are today, although I don't have actual exact numbers on that. But the society does still exist. But we were, the early club headquarters were the meeting place for these women, and we did have joint meetings with the club and with the Society of Women Geographers, I think once a year for, I think it was for like an 8-year period at least, or at least that's as long as it's minuted. Yeah. So there were, so there was, these joint meetings where, again, the men of the Explorers Club kind of said, oh yeah, let's hear from the ladies of the Society of Women Geographers. I'm sure they've been up to something. And then, of course, all of these wonderful things came out about what they were doing and their work, and really opened a lot of eyes for some people who maybe didn't think women deserved to be part of that conversation.
And as we're talking about the role of institutions, Milbry, you started out with how historically scientific institutions had barred women from joining and participating. and receiving a formal education. And you've seen that, change from when you first joined the Explorers Club, when they allowed women in, to now. What is the importance of institutions today in giving that sense of belonging to women and everyone looking to have a sense of camaraderie and support as they endeavor to do extraordinary and often dangerous things?
Well, no matter what the organization is, it's very important to include everybody who's qualified to join, because you can't exclude people, because you lose. You as the organization loses as much as the individual loses. So I think it's critically important that the Explorers Club is now welcoming women, and as I understand it, from our work and we were all on the same committee working on women at the club. We have about 800 members now, 800 women, and I think something like half of the young members that are joining are women. So that's really, really terrific. And of course, we have to work on inclusion for all kinds of people that want to contribute to this world. And it's just terribly important that we open the doors and open the possibility of camaraderie, of opportunity to everybody who wants to be part of it.
Yeah, and to expand on that just a little, it's really incredible to see how the club has, and how women have sort of made their mark on the club. For the past few years, our under 35 applicants and new members have been more women than men, which really says a lot about women and their involvement in the field, and how we want to get our voices out there, and we want our work to be acknowledged.
This is sort of a difficult question, but it's been asked a few times. How do you think the challenges have changed between, say, 100 years ago and today for women setting out to get out into the world, or some of the usual suspects that remain the same?
They've changed considerably. Women have always been explorers. That's something we discovered working on our book. Always. But it took a lot of perseverance, and you had to give up a lot of things. A lot of women didn't start exploring until their children had grown up, for instance, or until their husbands died, and they were then free to go out and do what they wanted to do. Nowadays, of course, you can start right out of the chute, when you're really young. And there are people like Meg Lauman who take their kids into the field with them, which I think is terrific. So I think it's totally changed, and it's now very acceptable for women to go out and be working in the field. I mean, all of you do, and probably most everybody listening to this tonight does. So it's still difficult, but when they started letting women into the scientific fields and into universities, things really started to change.
And there's just so much to say about the history of exploration, and something that you touched on was how it was often funded by governments and aristocrats, and therefore very narrowly accessible. I'd be curious from each of you, what is your definition of exploration? How do you see it today in the world? What role does it play, and why is it so important as we're facing such critical challenges to adopt the mindset of an explorer?
Lacey, do you want to go?
Sure. So I often ask this question when I have my young explorers with me, and it's one of the best things I can throw out to 5-year-olds is, what does it mean to be an explorer? What does exploration mean? And Don Walsh, I think, defined exploration as curiosity in action, and that is my working definition of exploration. Now, full disclosure, I'm not an explorer. I just take care of their things, but as the curator. But that definition is so simple yet so impactful, right? It's as simple as, if you have a question, you go out and answer it. And exploration is this ongoing thing, right? So many people do still say, what's left to explore? Haven't we found everything? Can't you Google whatever you want to Google? And the incredible thing about exploration is once you answer that first question and come to the conclusion of your first hypothesis, you open up dozens of others that you didn't know were possible until you've answered that first question. And so as technology changes, as perceptions are changing, as cultures change, as mindsets change, as the climate changes, there is so much left to do and see. And, you know, think about in your own lives on a really small scale. If you go to the same place 10 times, you're still going to find something new every time you go there, right? And so that's what our members are doing when they're going back to a place that they've been already. But conversely, there's still so much left to discover. Think about Mars, right? Think about all of the work being done in space, but also think about all the work being done on our planet, right? There have been more people to have walked on the moon than there have been to the deepest point in the ocean. And so, you know, think about all of those things, right? What's left to explore, what's left to see, it's infinite. So that's kind of how I define exploration and see it moving forward, is these new technologies, these new, I mean, I think it's incredible when we hear these stats of, well, you know, that so-and-so is a member and they actually just had to create their own field of science to come up with this incredibly minute detail and to answer this incredibly specific hypothesis that they had, you know, when it comes to things like listening to coral or, you know, thinking about ocean acidification or whatever it might be. You know, they're really trailblazing and carving their own path and kind of working with that very broad definition of exploration.
I agree with all of that. And I think that there is no end to exploration. There's always going to be something. And I think importantly that everyone should be part of this, because exploration is about knowledge. It's about learning about the world. It's learning about connections. It's a whole mindset. It's a way of living life that gives you personally a much richer life, because you're always learning and your curiosity is taking you places you never dreamed. So it's very important that exploration be inclusive for everyone, because we're facing so many challenges right now. And as my last slide shows, I see our Earth as a raft in the sea of universe. And if we don't learn how to take care of our raft, we're all going to sink. And explorers are the ones that are out on the edge, making those discoveries that help us learn how to take care of our raft. And so we all need to be part of this quest, because we're all living on this earth.
I love that. I think of the age-old adage of seeing with new eyes, no matter where you are, and finding new lens, which is available to us all when we move throughout the world. And I know so much of our membership is active in conservation and learning about other species. Of course, we're in this perilous moment where we're facing an extinction event and we're losing the stories of so many species we share this planet with. And I recently did an investigative story into cetaceans, whales, porpoises, and dolphins, and some of our membership is active in using new technologies to understand their language. I mean, just incredible. It wasn't until the 1970s that we even realized widely that whales sing, and now flash forward to being able to record them and use linguistics and machine learning to try to maybe perhaps even communicate with species. So it's really endless what we're able to do if we put that curiosity and action to the test, like you mentioned earlier, Lacey. This was a really interesting question for you, Milbry, with your collection. And I know beyond the books, you also have assembled these very thorough bibliographies that if uploaded and shared would be an immense resource for so many people doing research. Someone was asking about Indigenous communities that may have more oral traditions, and if you've found a way to be able to include those.
I would love to know more about that. Unfortunately, I'm not very good at language, but I think that there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done in Indigenous communities all around the world, because many of them do have very good oral history traditions. And that's where we're going to find a lot of really wonderful stories about women. And I really urge everyone that is capable to start going out and finding these stories before they're forgotten, and to record them. It's really important.
So before I end with telling everybody a bit more about the year ahead and what we have planned, Lacey, you have a couple of fans who would like to know if you have any plans to write a book of your own.
Not at the moment, but maybe talk to me next week. I don't know. But thank you. I appreciate the support.
We'll keep gently harassing you toward that end, perhaps. Well, thank you everybody so much for being here. This is the first lecture of many. We'll be doing them monthly. Our March topic will look at women in the polar regions. There is such, strong interest in the history of that. So we'll flash forward to current day and see what's happening there. And you can expect a new and exciting one every month. This spring, we'll launch our short film, which will feature Kathy Sullivan and Sylvia Earle, who you heard a bit about, as well as Anna Roosevelt, archaeologist, and Carol Beckwith, anthropologist, who has documented many tribes throughout the African continent. And Lacey as well, and Milbry. So we're very excited to show you that. And then we are going to be concluding early fall with a symposium, which will be a mashup of many speakers and people involved in the club and beyond. And so at any point, please get in touch with us, reach out. We want to hear from you and include you in these efforts and hear what you're up to. We'll be excited also to share a matrix that was a result of so many of you contributing information about what you're up to in your own photos. So we hope to stoke that sense of belonging that people have, said that they want out of institutions like this, and really bring us together in this quest to explore the world. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Milbry and Lacey. This was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katie.